three UVA guys presenting on a panel is trouble.
Uh-oh.
Welcome to the panel, Structuring Creative and Durable Joint Ventures. My name is Orlando Arce. I am a Program Vice President at the Local Initiative Support Corporation, and I will be serving as your moderator. We're very pleased to have some preeminent speakers on the panel, very, very knowledgeable individuals. They include Matt Greason. Matt is an attorney with Reno Kavanaugh who focuses on complex real estate transactions. Preston Lloyd, who is an attorney with Williams Mullins and heads up their land use practice, and David Bowers, Vice President and Mid-Atlantic Market Leader for Enterprise Community Partners. Before we begin, please feel free to use the question and answer button to ask your questions. We will try to get to as many of those questions as possible towards the end of the session. And so let me turn it over to Matt, who has had a great deal of experience in developing joint ventures and partnerships with a variety of individuals and organizations. Matt, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Orlando. I'm going to try to share my screen here so folks can see my slides. You'll have to excuse my possible lack of grace in doing that. It's good to be here with everyone today. Yeah, as Orlando said, I'm a partner at the law firm of Reno and Kavanaugh. We're based in DC with a couple national offices. I focus my practice on the representation of developers and nonprofits, including governmental entities, housing-focused and non-housing focused nonprofits, and some faith-based. We also represent some faith-based communities in the development of affordable housing across the country, and that takes a lot of different forms. What we're talking about here today, and I'm hoping to build on the last hour of this conference. Unfortunately, I was not able to join that hour, but try to build on the sort of the how a nonprofit or a faith-based community would enter into a successful and durable joint venture, which would enable it to use some land that it has in the development of affordable housing in partnership with a developer entity, and using tax credits and other forms of affordable housing subsidy to make that happen. So I'm going to focus this presentation today at the audience that I'm working towards here is nonprofits and faith-based communities that don't have vast experience in that area. But I anticipate there might be developers or others on who do have that experience, but we're going to try to hit on some of the fundamentals of what these deal structures look like and what the key issues are in making that land available to the development entity and making it available for tax credits and the development of affordable housing. And then also in terms of entering into the joint venture or the business arrangement with those developers in order to make sure that you have a project that stands the test of time and obtains reaches the goals that your organization sets forth. So just to start on some sort of elemental matters, and I don't know again what was covered in the last hour, but I want to make sure that we're all speaking the same vocabulary. The project will, at the end of the day, be owned by either a limited partnership or an LLC as the owner entity. And that owner entity will have usually 2, occasionally more members, one of which is the tax credit investor who invests the equity funds and obtains the vast majority benefit of the tax credits. And the other is the general partner, which may be the joint venture between the development entity and the nonprofit, depending on the structure that you take. And typically, right, the tax credit investor is mostly there to provide the funds and obtain the benefit of the tax credits, and the managing member owns, constructs, develops, operates the project. So just to illustrate that, you see the ownership entity there in the center with a general partner, which may be comprised of 1 or more members, as well as the tax credit investor, and that entity, that LP or that LLC, owns the land, either pursuant to a ground lease or in fee simple, which is to say they receive a deed to the project from the nonprofit or the other religious entity that is able to give them some excess land that it has. I want to talk about the spectrum of the level of involvement that nonprofit might engage in, in order to be involved in the project. So if you think about who owns the project, right? Who is that general partner? It could be sort of on a range of, and there's a range of involvement that the nonprofit could take in that venture, right? On the one hand, which is the left-hand side of this screen, which is A there, the developer could take sole ownership of the project. And it would, that would be either a deed or a ground lease to a entity that is controlled by a developer, which only has that developer as its general partner. You might have agreements with the developer, providing for certain things related to the project, but it's owned entirely by the developer, and the ground lease and the other documents are the only documents that govern the relationship between those parties. And you don't have an ownership interest in the project itself. And the developer, therefore, is responsible for all of the development matters, including arranging financing and providing for construction of the project. Between A and B here, there are other models that we could take, which we'll discuss about here in a moment, which is a joint venture between the for-profit developer and the nonprofit entity. In that instance, there may still be a ground lease from that nonprofit to the owner entity or a deed, but the nonprofit may have an ownership interest in that general partner entity, which would enable it to a share of the profits, perhaps some of the developer fee, and also perhaps a greater degree of control over the long-term outcome and operations of the project. And it may be, B here is a fee-based developer, right? You may maintain, the nonprofit or an affiliate thereof may maintain ownership of the project, and the developer may come in and for a fee, for the developer fee or a portion of the developer fee, may develop the project and then at completion hand it over to use to operate and run. And then on the right-hand side, this is something we typically see, right, more with our housing-focused nonprofit clients or public housing authorities, public and quasi-public entities that they might take full ownership of the project, do all of the work themselves, and there would be no developer involved. And that that's typically for folks who have more experience and competency in that real estate area. I want to talk a little bit about what a ground lease would look like between your entity and a nonprofit or a faith-based community or another organization and the development entity, the ownership entity. The nonprofit retains the ownership of the land, the fee simple interest. The ownership entity gets a leasehold interest in the land and receives a fee simple interest in the improvements, which enables it to claim the tax credits. These ground leases are long-term ground leases. They're typically, you often see 99-year ground leases. There is an opportunity for shorter ground leases. I'm sure there are nonprofits out there who would say, well, we only want a 15 or a 20-year ground lease, which is, the tax credit compliance period, or a 30-year ground lease, which is the extended use period for a tax credit project. Unfortunately, in order for the tax credit entity to have true ownership of the project for tax purposes, in order to claim those ground leases, usually something in the 50, 55, or 60-year range is the minimum that a tax credit investor will conclude is sufficient for the purposes of their tax analysis. So you don't typically see ground leases that are shorter than between 50 and 60 years. But that's an element, that you want to negotiate with your developer entity up front. Which, it brings me to a related topic, which is to say, you want to be thinking about all of the topics in this presentation today, both from me and Preston and David, as you're negotiating these deals, and you want to get your attorneys and your consultants involved early, right? So you're thinking about tax issues, control issues, and other things that are going to be important for the long-term interest of your project. Another economic term that's important is the compensation you get for the project. It may be, right, if you are handing full control of the project over to the developer, that you need more compensation, for the land that you're getting. You want to think about if you're going to have an annual rent to receive that compensation, or if it's going to be capitalized and payable up front, at the closing of the project. And I mentioned earlier that there may be an alternative, right, to a ground lease, which is to just deed the entity, the land to the ownership entity, and you could do that with or without a reverter right, which is to say the land returns to you after a certain period of time. And that's really a decision that you need to make, on a business and legal front. If the ground lease, you receive that return of that land after the term of the ground lease, and you have certain compliance monitoring rights, and you can make sure that the project is, meeting your standards as you kind of determine on a business front. The negative of that, right, is you do have to maintain that ground lease, right, and you have a long-term contract with that ownership entity, and so you need to be prepared to do that asset management work. Turning to a joint venture with the developer, and again, this is if you want to be in the deal with the developer entity, you want an ownership stake in the project, which is typically in the form of a minority ownership interest in the general partner or managing member of the project. And what you need to think about there up front is, what rights are you going to have as a minority member? Are you going to have rights to approve the design of the building? Are you going to have rights to monitor construction? Are you going to have rights to approve changes to social services plans or alterations of the project? There's a whole range of things you need to think about in this, in the scope of this 99-year plus relationship that you're going to enter into that enables you to build this affordable housing. Just to kind of hit on some larger point issues here with joint ventures that you'll want to think about as you enter into them. It is often the case that a tax credit investor in its limited partnership or operating agreement at the closing of the project will grant a purchase option to the general partner to purchase the project at fair market value. The tax code, however, provides that a nonprofit, a designated nonprofit, may have the right to purchase the project at a below market value, which is typically the sum of the project's debt plus exit taxes for the investor when they leave the project. So you want to make sure that you're negotiating for that right of first refusal on the most favorable terms up front when you're negotiating with your developer partner, and that they're going to push for that for you as they negotiate with the investor entity. And that right of first refusal will take effect after the tax credit compliance period, which is the first 15 years of the project. You want to think, as you're negotiating your business deal, about guarantees, who's going to offer the guarantees. You may want, it may be the case that you need the developer entity to offer all of the guarantees. And there are both your typical construction loan and permanent loan guarantees, recourse and non-recourse, completion and others. And then there's also tax credit guarantees, completion, operating deficits. You may be required to guarantee the operating deficits of the project, as well as tax credit recapture if something happens that the IRS says, comes after the tax credits, if there's a violation of certain rules and regulations governing the project. And there is IRS guidance limiting, which guarantees nonprofits can give in LIHTC deals, things that enable them to continue the charitable purpose of their organization. They have to be compliant with that requirement. And then finally, you'll want to think, as you get into the closing stages, about whether or not a 168 election is appropriate. That's another major thing that comes up. And that's an election that your entity, you will typically have a blocker entity between you and the general partner that will enable you, and it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but it treats the income coming from the project as taxable income rather than tax exempt income, which is what you would normally have. And while that sounds counterintuitive, it enables you to claim better depreciation for the project, including bonus depreciation, and goes into your tax credit pricing and how much equity you can get for your project. So you'll want to make sure you have your accountants and attorneys on alert to make that election. So that's sort of a high-level view of the legal and business issues involved in the joint venture, enabling you to enter into a affordable housing project on your land. And if you have any questions, I think we'll have a Q&A session here, and take advantage. I'll hand it back to Orlando.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. That was great. Why don't we move on to Preston and have him do his remarks.
Great. Thank you, Orlando. Nice to meet everyone virtually this afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to join. Like Matt, I'm going to attempt to share my screen and presentation, and these materials are available online via the app and the online link that I think you've been provided. My background is as a land use practitioner. Specifically, I've worked with a host of affordable housing developers, be it for-profit, nonprofit, and those have taken a variety of forms, and oftentimes that form has had an impact on how that project navigates a public entitlement process. And that's really what I want to focus on, is some of those considerations for entities that may be considering some sort of project that may have an interface, as these projects often do, with rezoning or some other entitlement that would be required to get approval to move forward. So again, the overview today, first talk about just entitlements and development timeline generally, and then focus specifically on joint venture deal structures and the related land use considerations, really tracking with the foundation that Matt's presentation helped to set the table for moments ago. So first, let's talk about just land use 101. How do projects get entitled, and what is the general timeline that projects can expect? And this will be well known to many on the video conference today. But the first step, of course, is the land use decision. Is the property zoned appropriately for the desired use? If it's not, and if a rezoning is required, and it may be a rezoning, or it may be a special use permit or a conditional use permit, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the nuances of those particular entitlements, that's the first step. And really the key is that that's a legislative decision that gets made by the elected board of county supervisors, or the city council or town council for the jurisdiction, depending on the government structure that you're dealing with. And so that's a very public process. It's a political process. It confers political risk. And it's something that is going to involve public hearings, community engagement, and requires some thought as to how that should be navigated. As you move forward from that rezoning decision, things get a little bit more granular. You move towards site plan, or sometimes called a plan of development approval, and then ultimately building permit approval. These are much more ministerial actions, which has a legal context, meaning that rather than being open to the legislative discretion of the elected body, these are much more check the box. If you meet all of the requirements of the jurisdiction's development ordinance, and it may be set forth in the zoning ordinance or in the subdivision ordinance, if you meet those requirements, essentially then you get the approval that you seek. And while it still has some risk associated with it, it's a different magnitude of risk than certainly a rezoning or a legislative decision. And typically those would not require a public hearing, which is an important distinction. To try to drill down a little bit further on what the differences are between those, the rezoning approvals that I mentioned. A conditional rezoning is what we refer to in Virginia sometimes as a rezoning that has proffers. That's when an applicant voluntarily offers some sort of additional condition concerning the use of the land, and that becomes baked into the zoning that applies to this particular property or project. And that's important to note because as you're conducting your diligence and trying to figure out, do I even have what I need, or am I going to have to go forward with some sort of rezoning? It's not as simple necessarily as just checking the zoning ordinance. You have to figure out, are there proffers that are out there that I need to review as well that constrain or create obligations on the part of the property owner? And then the special use permit or conditional use permit may be required in certain instances, especially if you're seeking a certain density or if it's a supportive housing project or has something that includes emergency housing, for instance. Many of those, the ordinances and jurisdictions throughout Virginia are going to include a requirement that that go forward for approval by the elected body, even if otherwise it would have been a by right project. And finally, I'll mention this, although this doesn't often come into play for affordable projects. There's a different context called sometimes a planned unit development. You can think of this as a very large master plan development. In many cases, an ordinance will allow those to an applicant to essentially propose their own zoning that corresponds to different portions of a master plan community. And so if you have an affordable project that's part of a much larger master plan community, sometimes the rezoning may take the form of the PUD, which is a little bit different than your standard conditional rezoning or SUP. Before proceeding with the rezoning, it's always important to understand what does the comprehensive plan contemplate for the particular property, and also to talk to the planning director and even the elected official who's responsible for the district that the property is located in, because if it appears that you may need to move forward with the legislative process, getting that early intel can sometimes tell you if you're incurring resources and costs towards something that's really dead on arrival. And that moves us into the specifics of how land use comes into play with a affordable joint venture. As most folks are probably aware, the LIHTC application process requires a zoning certification from the locality. And so that, if you go back to the development timeline that I highlighted, it's the first step. It requires a confirmation from the jurisdiction that the proposed use is authorized, which means when you're getting a property teed up to submit for tax credits, you need to make sure that you've got a plan for how you can get to the appropriate rezoning or SUP or CUP that you're going to need. And it's something that requires a lot of forethought, as Matt described. It's one of those things that can be affected by how you structure the deal. I mentioned a few things here that may be relevant to you conducting diligence on such a project. It goes beyond just checking what the current use is, but even thinking about who's the owner currently, and if the owner is going to change. For instance, if it's a church and there's going to be a joint venture where the church contributes the land, certain uses may be permitted by a faith-based organization that if it's owned by a nonprofit or a for-profit organization, sometimes that can create nuances in how the zoning ordinance is going to be applied. And so these are all things that need to be vetted. And as I mentioned previously, the existence of any proffers that may bind the property, it goes beyond just what's in the ordinance itself. So when it comes time to negotiate the contract, it's important to think about who owns the land today. Is it a public entity? Is it a nonprofit? Are they a faith-based organization, as I mentioned? And then is that going to be the entity that's responsible for the rezoning, or is it going to be the developer? And what's the allocation of responsibility between those two? And that decision can be driven by who has the best community relationship, who's going to be trusted by stakeholders in the community, and is there a reputational risk to any of these players? Whereas if this proposal is not well received, is that going to create potential adverse impacts on the ability of a project's proponent to try and do similar projects in the same jurisdiction? Finally, it's important to think about the diligence period that's baked into your contract. You want to make sure that you've got ample time to evaluate the current rezoning and whether you need to, the current zoning, and whether you need to go through an entitlement process. And then if you do, think about phasing it in such a way that you only have the obligation to close after you've obtained all final both rezoning and even perhaps site plan and plan of development approvals that would be required. Other considerations that can come into play is the land owned by a locality. If so, and I've run into this on numerous occasions, sometimes this is how an affordable housing project gets legs. It's contributed by a locality that is seeking to create additional affordable units. And so they contribute the property, and ultimately the rezoning is going to be done by the project's proponent or the development joint venture. When that's the case, the disposition of the property by the public entity requires an entirely separate public process to be navigated. That can involve a procurement process, and so understanding whether an unsolicited offer has to be made, whether there's a requirement for the property be surplused, and even a supermajority vote of the governing body of the locality. Those can all be things that add considerable time to your timeline in order to make sure that you have the evidence of site control that's going to be necessary to submit your tax credit application. Likewise, if the property is owned by an EDA or a public housing authority, these are quasi-public bodies, and so the process is a little bit different than it would be if it was owned outright by the locality, but it can still add time, cost, and risk to a project. And so being able to mitigate that risk, or at least plan for it as part of your contract negotiations, becomes particularly important. And finally, sometimes those public housing authorities or EDAs or even the locality itself, when they're going to be the grantor and transfer the land, they're going to want to make sure that the land is ultimately going to be used for the affordable use that they want it to be used for. And sometimes the way that they try to secure a guarantee on that is that they will include reversionary rights or some other sort of deed covenant, which can often be a poison pill for the purpose of your equity closing or your financing. And so having candid conversations with the jurisdiction and even the city attorney or county attorney's office about how you navigate that becomes important, because it can often become a roadblock in providing comfort to the locality that you're going to do what you say you're going to do, but at the same time, not creating a situation where the land is essentially not lendable as a result. So those are a few key points related to land use. Orlando, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Preston. David, let's turn it over to you then.
Great, thank you, Preston. I appreciate it. Hope everyone can hear me clearly here. And I will pull this up. Let's see. There we go. All right, so it's good to be here with everyone. Thanks for the invitation to be a part of the conversation today. So just very quickly, where I'm from, Enterprise, we're a proven, powerful nonprofit, improves communities and people's lives by making well-designed homes affordable, connected to opportunity. We bring kind of a platform of capital and policy work and programmatic work, as well as being an owner, developer, operator of 13,000 units in the Mid-Atlantic region. We've been around for 35 years, over 52 billion in financing, touching over 660,000 homes around the country. Okay, let me see, plays down, there we go. So where we're focused on Enterprise going forward, just to let folks know, 3 big pillars in our new strategic plan: increasing housing supply, advancing racial equity and upward mobility, and building resilience and well-being, the resilience of the built environment as well as of communities themselves, the people who live there. We are, okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I'm with our Mid-Atlantic office here and cover DC, Maryland, and Virginia as our footprint. We have a focus on preserving and producing affordable housing, bridging racial equity gaps, and growing the pie of resources through our policy platform and other ways, and trying to work on with other partners around ending homelessness in the region. And you'll see that we, again, kind of bring to bear some of the Enterprise tools in terms of financing. So as it relates to that priority, where I want to spend the bulk of the time on, one, also starting to dig into our faith-based development initiative. And I'll be speaking from that perspective. So We have had strategic advisors with our initiative, some local nonprofits, East of the River Clergy Police Community Partnership, Georgetown University, Wesley Seminary, and the University of Baltimore is now current FBDI program partner. We started in 2006, and our goal was really quite simple. How do we get new units of housing and community facilities developed that serve low and moderate income communities? We work with houses of worship who have undeveloped or underdeveloped land to help make an informed go or no-go decision about development, and then help connect those houses of worship to critical development, legal, and capital resources. The why may seem obvious, but I like to state it. So we know the needs are out here. 20% of renters around the country and around this region pay more than 50% of their income for housing. They're living severely cost burden. You got nearly 10,000 homeless just here in the DC metro region, DC, Maryland, Virginia metro area, and their economic and other disparities by ethnicity and geography. What I think is really critical, oftentimes an eye opener, is the potential that houses of worship own a large amount of real estate. Last year, the Urban Institute looked at 800 vacant parcels owned by houses of worship in Arlington and Fairfax in Virginia, Montgomery County and Washington, D.C. And they estimated that just on those 800 vacant parcels in those four jurisdictions, their rough estimate was that anywhere from 43,000 to 109,000 new housing units could be built. So there's tremendous potential there when we think of the faith community as partners, potential partners in doing development. So what we do, kind of trainings on different aspects of the development process, not designed to make houses of worship experts, but to make them comfortably conversant. And so we cover a range of different topics, provide different types of capital, particularly early catalytic capital, grants for market studies and feasibility analysis, and early pre-development recoverable grants. We say the access to a full range of enterprise products, but one of the things we encourage faith partners is shop for everything, for your partners, professional partners, your financing, lawyers, developers, et cetera. Make sure you're looking around the like. We also provide technical assistance, different types of organizational development, mentioned the market analysis, the project specific development, TA, kind of owner's rep type of services, consultants. Are critical. Reference to referrals to legal services, partnerships with pro bono legal providers or providers. Sometimes people say they want to, whether it's pro bono, low bono, or full bono, right? We've had some clergy leaders say, I want to pay full freight, so I know I'm getting my call answered. That's fine, but as long as we tell them, make sure you have a real estate lawyer, two of whom you've heard from already today. Development consultants, right, and developers. So bullpen of developers and development consultants. We don't tell people who to work with, but when it comes to picking a development partner, but give them a sense of the types of questions they should be asking, and then names of several folks out of the bullpen who can help, they can interview and see if there's a fit. We've been able to get successfully over 1,500 units online, plus a community health clinic and a banquet meeting hall, 1,000 units in the pipeline, hosted over 50 training sessions, 22 networking luncheons, and the current partnership, University of Baltimore, has produced 22 graduates from the Faith-Based Development Certificate Program. A couple of examples of Virginia projects: Gilliam Place in Arlington, Arlington Presbyterian Church, and APA developed a beautiful project that opened last year in Arlington. And back in 2011, AHC worked with Macedonia Baptist Church to develop this 36-unit project right there in the Arlington, in the Knock neighborhood, that also provided some ground floor commercial space as well. So for the last 4 minutes or so of my presentation, what I want to do is focus on a couple slides of really some lessons learned and questions, key questions, so that partners who are listening now, who may be houses of worship or faith-based, or if you're a development partner or financing partner, these are the types of questions that we're encouraging houses of worship to think about before as they're going into the process of thinking about what to do, who to partner with, how to partner. So one is, do you have site control of the land to develop your vision? And do you want to maintain ownership and site control over the long term? I think Matt and Preston, both in their presentations, alluded to, right, issues related to control. Most houses of worship, if they're not looking to simply sell and kind of cash out, they're going to want to maintain site control over the long term. So being mindful of that on their end, but also from the partner's end, is very important. We ask them about what their short and long-term economic goals are for the house of worship. Are they expecting cash flow over time from the development? Are they looking to subsidize the project for impact and ministry reasons? Or are they looking for, hey, as long as this breaks even, we're okay? We often say to folks, there's not a right or wrong answer, but they need to be intentional about asking that question. And then again, knowing the answer to that will inform how they negotiate and interface with their potential development partner. Are they willing to contribute any portion of the land value for maybe income targeting reasons, for example, or make the deal more doable, pencil out more? And so they need to understand that. Are they doing it? Are they going to contribute or not? What are the implications of that in terms of the business deal, short-term and long-term? What type of housing and community facility do they want to develop? What's the targeted impact, obviously? Do they have economic empowerment interest or racial equity related goals? Do they want to, in addition to just developing a LIHTC project and bringing units online, which is great, do they want to create certain types of jobs or have people who can take advantage of certain types of jobs? Do they want to support minority-owned businesses along the value chain? As I like to say, there are a lot of folks who get paid on an affordable housing deal, right? So everything from the landscaper to the title company to the lawyer to the contractors, a lot of folks get paid. Where's the money get banked? And so asking that question. Does the house of worship expect to have an active role in the development? Yes or no? Do they have a separate entity for development? Is there a firewall between the development partnership and the house of worship, making sure that's addressed? Is there a development team and a main point of contact in place? Who's the decision maker for the house of worship? And again, this critical question about, do they have a real estate attorney that represents just the house of worship, not the lawyer for the partnership, but the lawyer whose only interest is the house of worship. So on this final slide, really a few, again, some key lessons learned. Unfamiliarity with the development process and the fear of the unknown will often lead to no action by houses of worship. So there's kind of two angles that are kind of bad. One is they take no action. And we're not saying everyone who has land ought to build, but being intentional about, again, making an informed go decision. Or sometimes they get taken advantage of. So that making sure they're familiar with the process goes to that second bullet, where the technical assistance is often needed, the capacity building, getting them familiar with, and this is where the third bullet comes in, the intellectual capital is oftentimes as important or more important than the financial capital, again, to make sure the clergy and the lay leadership are comfortable and making the go, no go decision, getting to completion of the development, knowing how to identify the professionals like real estate lawyers and others who can help them. Be mindful, I always tell folks the timelines are different. The frame of reference for developers is quarterly. The frame of reference in the faith community is eternity. So oftentimes we have to slow down the developers and speed up the faith community and help them meet somewhere in the middle. Knowing that at times mistrust and a lack of appreciation by both the house of worship and developers on what value add the other brings to the table can be an issue that has to be worked through in the relationship and the partnership. Some key issues that have already been addressed by the presenter so far, issues around guarantees, who gets paid what and when, control of the land over the long term, and again, who's making the decisions, being clear up front, what's in it for me, and having the clergy leader casting vision and gaining buy-in from the membership, and then delegating kind of day-to-day management are just some of the issues that need to be dealt with and addressed. Invite folks, as you get this file, visit the website, check out more information, also this paper that's available, particularly for houses of worship, to give you a sense of the process. So Orlando, I think I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, David. And thank you, Preston and Matt, for your remarks. It was a very comprehensive approach to the subject. We have one question. David, thanks for your presentation. COVID-19 is having a significant economic impact on the continuity of faith communities, perhaps affording a new opportunity for accelerating redevelopment for affordable, accessible housing. How is Enterprise preparing for this opportunity?
Yeah, it's a great question and appreciate it. So a few ways I'd answer that. One, we have some regular training series that are targeted for the faith community. And one of the sessions we had just in the last few months was around, as we say, taking care of the health of the pastor, the parish, and the people. And so really having intentional conversation about what does it mean for the leadership in a house of worship to be mindful of the health of the community around it, the health of the house of worship as a house of worship, and the health of the clergy leadership itself as they're going through these stressful times. So part of it is intentional conversations and thinking with house of worship about how do they position themselves to, as they're dealing with issues around staying open, staying afloat, staying relevant, but also thinking long-term, right? Not just in survival mode, but also if you had a ministry you were thinking about doing before COVID, some sort of development, how do you think intentionally, connect with philanthropy, connect with government leaders, connect with your own membership, connect with your development partners, to think about how to keep the eye on the ball with that eye on the prize as it relates to that development. So part of it is just the intentionality about the conversations. There are also conversations going on about what does it mean to potentially repurpose the space, the physical space that houses of worship have, and people thinking not only in terms of during COVID, but even after COVID, will habits change in terms of how people gather collectively. And so how do you use that space now, and how do you think about how that space may get repurposed afterwards?
Thanks, David. Preston, should a nonprofit get zoning approvals in advance of entering a joint venture with a for-profit developer?
I don't think it necessarily has to be in advance, but the question becomes, who's taking the risk for that? And typically, this is something that will require a little bit of some resources to be allocated in order to navigate that process. And so having a candid conversation early on between the joint venture members as to how those resources are going to be allocated and that responsibility is important. I think that it can sometimes be to the advantage of a project to have a nonprofit, especially one that has a great reputation and is well known in a community, to help be out front, to help guide a project. But it's a case-by-case situation. Sometimes there are communities that are already going to have some trepidation about what an affordable project means, especially in certain neighborhoods that aren't as familiar with that and may perceive that to mean something that it's not. And so who the appropriate party to provide that community education and outreach is needs to be part of that conversation. So the short answer, Orlando, is that every deal is a little bit different, but it doesn't necessarily have to be done prior to entering into the joint venture, as long as the parties understand who bears the responsibility for getting it done.
Great. Thanks, Preston. Matt, I was wondering if you could give a case study of an example of a project that you've been through that shows the joint venture aspects of your presentation.
Sure. So we have a project ongoing in the District of Columbia as between a house of worship and a for-profit developer. They've got a large piece of land next to their project, next to their church. I think it's currently used as parking. It's a prime location in the District of Columbia. And what they've done is they've entered into a multi-phase development agreement with the developer, right? And so the land is carved up into several phases, and the developer has, an option to pursue each of those. Currently they're working on developing phase one, and in this instance, right, the house of worship is taking a significant acquisition payment right up front, and they're not a part of the joint venture entity, and they're not, as a result, there's not a tax exemption, which you might sometimes get from a nonprofit or house of worship in the District of Columbia. They don't get tax credit allocation based on a nonprofit set aside or anything like that, but it does sort of remove them from the day-to-day operation of the project, and it makes their life a little bit easier, and they get both the acquisition payment to fund their going forward operations and capital improvements, and then they're also get the benefit of using that land to provide affordable housing for their community.
Great, thanks. All right. You have any other questions from the audience? I guess not. All right.
Orlando, this is David. One thing I'll say very quickly to folks who are listening is that it's to folks who may be from the faith community, it's these projects doing development is absolutely challenging and difficult and also imminently doable. And I think that panels like this afford an opportunity to say that there are a number of professionals, legal, heard from two great presentations today, developers, right, financiers. There are folks who do this every day. Yes, it's challenging. Yes, it can be time consuming, but it's also, again, very doable. So we encourage on the faith community side, be mindful of that, be careful and discerning about who you engage with in terms of collaboration and partnership, right? Everyone who can do it may not have the same values and integrity that you have. So you want to make sure you're vetting that, right? And again, the importance of shopping around, not just going with a friend or the first person you talk to. And then on the developer kind of professional side, if you would, lawyers and developers and financiers, to understand and appreciate and have respect for what the house of worship brings to the table. We've been doing this now, except for almost 15 years. And there's been an interesting evolution of the perception of the faith community as partners, right? Certainly faith community have been doing it long before we got started, but we heard explicitly from people, like, why would we work with them? That's not what they do, right? They're not why there? And over time, and in the faith community, sometimes would say, why would we want to do development? We're a church or a synagogue or a mosque, whatever it may be. So understanding that there's a need, there's the ability to get it done, professionals out there, understanding the value that both sides bring is also important in establishing. So the joint venture is really, there's also a relationship aspect there. It can be long-term in some cases. So there's kind of the legal aspect of it, the business aspect of it, but also the covenantal, right? The relational aspect that's important for folks on all sides to appreciate. But we have to be more creative in our industry and engaging in creative ways, like with House of Worship, like with VFW halls. I know App up in Northern Virginia has done a fantastic project with the VFW hall. So we have to continue to think in our industry about being creative.
Okay. We have another question. David, who are the drivers for this work in HOWS? HOWS. What stimulates action?
Yeah, so what stimulates action is a common connection that you have to answer to. There may be drivers from a bishop or a denominational regional leader. If you're more in a congregational polity, decisions made at the local level, like in a Baptist church, then it is oftentimes either the clergy leadership or lay leadership, trustees, deacons, and the like. So it really does depend oftentimes in terms of at a technical level, the polity of the congregation and what kind of decisions have been made about who's going to make the final decision.
Great, thanks. All right, we have come to the end of the session. I want to thank our three panelists for doing a terrific, very comprehensive job of responding to the question of joint ventures. Thank you all, and the session is archived, right, Molly?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, so the session is archived for the benefit of anyone who wishes to come back and reuse it. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
Yes, thank you so much to all of the panelists for taking the time to join us today. So we have a quick break coming up, and then from 2 to 3, we have our last 2 sessions of the day. So you have the option of joining COVID and Construction Today and Beyond with Will Farrell, Taylor Davis, Rick Kotke, Tom Leibel, and Noah Hale. And then the other session from 2 to 3 is the other credits: State Housing Credit, Historic Credit, NMTC, and OZ. And that's with Bob Newman, Adam Stockmaster, Jess Worthington, Chris Height, and Mike Chapa. But thank you all again, and we hope to see you at the next session.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.